There are creatures on our planet that you could very easily mistake for something else entirely. They're incredibly intelligent, and at times their behavior baffles even the scientists who've dedicated long years of their lives to studying them. They're drawn to solitude and spend most of their allotted time alone. And on top of that, they behave in such a strikingly human way that many people who've watched them up close have felt a little uneasy. Every evening, when the light begins to fade above the forest, these creatures set to work and build themselves a bed right where night happens to find them. They carefully select suitable branches, bend them, weave them together, and settle in for the night high above the ground in a safe nest that didn't even exist that morning. They can plan their movements many hours in advance, as if they keep a schedule of their own day in their heads and know exactly where they'll head tomorrow. And they raise and patiently teach their young for nearly 10 years straight, an astonishingly long time in the wild, where most animals reach adulthood in a matter of months. And here's what's most surprising of all. Despite their impressive size and considerable weight, these creatures almost never come down to the ground. They live their entire lives high in the air, among the branches and broad leaves, in the dense, humid forests of distant Asia, the very forests that, as we speak, are vanishing from the face of the earth at an alarming rate. They're called orangutans. They're the silent loners of the treetops and the true giants of the jungle. They're animals of remarkable, at times almost unsettling intelligence. And perhaps the most important thing that anyone who's ever met their gaze notices is their eyes. Attentive, calm, somehow deeply knowing and a little sorrowful eyes that you can never forget afterward. People who've seen that look just once will talk about it for years. To meet orangutans, we'll have to travel far from the places we know, to where the air is heavy and thick with moisture, where the ground beneath your feet never fully dries, and the greenery is so dense it's easy to lose your bearings in it. Orangutans live in only 2 places on our entire planet, and nowhere else. You can find them only in the humid forests of the islands of Borneo and Sumatra. These 2 islands have become the last home and the last reliable refuge for the red apes, and beyond them, they simply don't exist in the wild. This forest world operates by its own rules, nothing like ours. It's a world of deep silence, broken now and then by the distant cries of birds and cautious rustlings in the foliage. It's a world of endless warm rain, soft black mud at the foot of enormous trees, and heavy ripe fruit hiding somewhere high in the canopy, out of reach for most of its inhabitants. It's a world where each new day brings a quiet struggle for survival, invisible to the outside observer, but persistent and unceasing. And the most unusual thing about it is that the orangutan's entire life takes place not down below on solid ground, the way ours does, but high up, several dozen meters above it, in a green, airy space that humans can hardly reach without specialized equipment. And here's something very important to understand from the very start of our conversation, before we go any further. Orangutans are not simply exotic apes from far-off tropical countries that you can curiously look at in colorful photographs. They're among the closest living relatives we humans have on all of Earth. And the longer scientists observe these animals, the more clearly they realize just how thin, almost transparent, the line is that separates their world from our own. People sensed this kinship many centuries ago, long before real science came along. The local inhabitants, who lived side by side with these apes, looked at the orangutan's long arms, at its thoughtful face, at the way it held fruit in its paws, and saw in it something familiar, something kindred. They gave it special names, told stories about it, and treated it more like a forest neighbor than an ordinary beast. And many centuries later, modern research, with its expensive instruments and complex experiments, only confirmed what those people felt in their hearts. In the coming minutes, we'll try to get to know the orangutan for real, not the way it's usually portrayed. We'll figure out where its strange name came from and why it describes the creature itself so precisely. we'll come to understand how such a heavy, large animal manages to spend its entire life high up on thin branches without ever once falling. We'll see why this giant prefers complete solitude while almost all of its relatives gather in large, noisy groups. We'll learn what a mother orangutan teaches her only child for a full 9 years, and why this bond is considered one of the most touching in the entire animal kingdom. And finally, we'll come to the hardest question of all, the answer to which concerns not just the apes, but ourselves, because this story, for all its beauty, has a flip side, a very sorrowful one. Orangutans have existed on Earth for millions of years. Over that vast stretch of time, they've survived climate shifts, droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, and dozens of other ordeals that could have wiped them off the planet. They've turned out to be astonishingly resilient and well adapted to life. And now, after all those millions of years, they've come right up to the edge of complete extinction. But the cause isn't some wild force of nature or natural catastrophe, the kind they long ago learned to adapt to. The cause is a single species that appeared on this planet far later than they did. That species is us. So our story today isn't only an account of a rare and remarkable animal from faraway forests. It's also an honest conversation about how easily we can lose forever those who resemble us so closely, and who perhaps deserve a very different sort of treatment. And there's no better way to begin that conversation than with the simplest question you could possibly ask. Who exactly is the orangutan, and why does its name, translated literally, sound almost like a verdict on all of us? Let's start with the name itself, because half the whole story is already hidden inside it. The word orangutan came to us from the Malay language, spoken by people who have lived alongside these apes from time immemorial. And it translates surprisingly simply and directly. Orang means person, and hutan means forest. Put these two words together, and you get a literal meaning that sends a slight chill down your spine. An orangutan is, literally, a person of the forest, a forest person. That's exactly what the locals called it long before the first travelers with notebooks ever made it here. And at first it might seem there's nothing particularly mysterious about this name. The logic seems to lie right on the surface, and would be obvious even to a child. The orangutan, like us, has 2 arms and 2 legs. It has a face on which you can read mood and thought. When it sits in the fork of a tree with its arms wrapped around its knees, its silhouette from a distance really does look like the figure of a person who sat down to rest. So it's hardly surprising that many hundreds of years ago, people noticed this resemblance and firmly tied the orangutan to themselves, placing it in their tales and legends somewhere halfway between beast and human. You might think this was just a naive mistake made by simple-hearted people who took a striking outward similarity for something more. But here's where the main twist in this whole story comes. Modern science, with all its rigorous methods and precise instruments, has carefully examined this ancient hunch, and it turned out that our distant ancestors weren't mistaken at all. Hidden in this resemblance is something far deeper than a mere coincidence of outlines. The orangutan is connected to humans not only on the outside, but in its very nature, in its origin, in the most subtle workings of its body and mind. The people who gave it the name Man of the Forest hit the nail squarely on the head without really understanding it themselves. To make sense of this kinship, we need to step back a little and look at the bigger picture. On our planet, there are only 3 genera of great apes that scientists consider closest to humans. These are chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. If we line them up by degree of kinship with us, chimpanzees turn out to be closest to humans, gorillas stand a little further off, and the orangutan takes 3rd place on this short and honorable list. The 3rd closest relative among all the living great apes is precisely our hero today. At the same time, the orangutan has one important feature that makes its story completely unique. Its branch separated from the common trunk earlier than all the others. While chimpanzees and gorillas turned onto their own separate path relatively recently, the ancestors of orangutans went their own way a very long time ago, more than 10 million years back. That's a truly enormous span of time, hard even to properly imagine. Over that period, whole epochs have come and gone on Earth, continents have shifted, and the outlines of seas have changed. And all this time, the orangutan line developed separately, on its own, gradually becoming more and more unlike the others. And here's what is especially striking against this backdrop. Despite such an enormous distance in time, despite millions of years of separate existence, the orangutan still has a remarkable amount in common with humans. This kinship shows itself most vividly in the realm of the mind, in the ability to think, learn, remember, and solve complex problems. But we'll talk about this remarkable intellect in detail a bit later because it deserves a separate and very attentive discussion. For now, let's simply take a proper look at the orangutan and figure out what it actually looks like. The first thing that catches your eye when you look at this animal is its arms. They are incredibly, almost unbelievably long. The arm span of an adult orangutan can exceed 2 meters, which is noticeably greater than the height and arm span of an average adult human. When an orangutan stretches its arms out to the sides, it seems they'll never end. And these long arms, as we'll soon see, are by no means a whim of nature, but the main working tool in its life, without which it simply couldn't exist where it lives. The second thing you can't help noticing is its coat. The orangutan is covered in thick red fur of a quite particular shade. Among the even, unbroken green of the jungle, this color flares up like a living flame or a tongue of fire accidentally lost among the foliage. Some individuals have light, almost golden fur that shimmers in the sunlight with warm honey tones. Others have dark, brown, thick, matte fur with no sheen at all. And then the orangutan looks almost black in the shade of the trees. This rich red color has become the animal's calling card, by which it's recognized the world over and can't be mistaken for anything else. And here lies yet another curious paradox that at first seems almost impossible. You'd think such a bright reddish-orange color would make the orangutan visible from far away, especially when the sun sinks toward the horizon, flooding the forest with warm golden light, and especially against the reddish-brown trunks of large trees, where, by all rights, red fur ought to leap out at any predator. But in reality, the very opposite happens. The orangutan is surprisingly good at blending into the forest around it. In the interplay of shadows, glints, and patches of sunlight, its red figure seems to dissolve among the branches, and spotting a motionless orangutan in a dense canopy can be genuinely difficult, even for an experienced observer who knows for certain that the animal is somewhere very close by. Now let's talk about the fact that orangutans come in different kinds, and this is an important part of our story. For a long time, it was believed that only one species of this ape existed in the world. Then scientists distinguished 2 separate species, and quite recently a third was added to them. So today science recognizes 3 species of orangutan. The first and most numerous is the Bornean orangutan, which lives on the island of Borneo. The second is the Sumatran orangutan, which lives, as you might easily guess from the name, on the island of Sumatra. And the third, the youngest by date of discovery and the rarest of them all, is the Tapanuli orangutan. The story of the Tapanuli orangutan deserves to be told separately because it's truly astonishing. This species was officially described by scientists very recently, only in 2017, and that, mind you, happened in our own time, not in some distant centuries of great discoveries. Researchers had known earlier about one small group of orangutans living in an isolated area called Tapanuli on the island of Sumatra. These apes kept to themselves, cut off from the others. But for a long time, they weren't considered anything special, and were assigned to species already known, with nothing unusual seen in them. The truth was revealed largely thanks to a careful study of skull structure. When scientists closely compared the skull of an orangutan from the Tapanuli region with the skulls of its kin from other territories, they were astonished to find serious and consistent differences. These differences were too pronounced to be a mere coincidence. Then genetic studies took up the case, looking at what's passed from parents to offspring and stored in the very foundation of every living organism. And these studies fully confirmed the suspicions that had arisen. The scientists were indeed facing a separate, independent species that had been going its own way for a very long time. But the joy of the discovery was immediately followed by alarm. This third species of orangutan turned out to be incredibly few in number. In the entire world, there are only about 800 Tapanuli orangutans. 800 individuals for the whole planet is very, very few for an entire species of large animal. And this makes the Tapanuli orangutan the rarest of all the great apes, and at the same time, the one that has come closest to the terrible brink of complete extinction. It so happened that humanity discovered this species, and in that very same moment, learned that it may be fading away right before our eyes. And here, on this sad note, the theme of threat sounds clearly in our story for the first time. The very theme that will gradually grow throughout our entire conversation, and at the very end will ring out in full force. We'll come back to it and talk about everything in detail, and honestly. For now, let's remember this alarming figure and move on to understand how the orangutan's everyday life is arranged, how this heavy red giant spends its days high above the ground, why it has chosen the path of a loner, and what price it has to pay for that. To truly understand the orangutan, the easiest thing is to compare it with the other great apes and immediately see how strongly it differs from them. And the most convenient place to start is with where exactly each of these apes spends its life. Because it's precisely here that an enormous, almost insurmountable gulf lies between the orangutan and its relatives. Take gorillas, for example. These mighty African giants spend almost all their time on the ground. They wander unhurriedly along the floor of moist forests, feed among the thickets, rest in sunlit clearings, and mostly stick to the lower level among grass, bushes, and fallen leaves. This is especially true of adult male gorillas, which weigh a great deal and for that reason almost never climb trees. A heavy male simply has no reason and no safe way to scramble upward, since fragile branches just wouldn't support its huge weight. So its entire life unfolds on solid ground. Chimpanzees are built a little differently and willingly climb trees for fruit or to bed down for the night. But they too spend a fair amount of time below, moving across the ground from one place to another in search of food. And against the backdrop of its ground-dwelling relatives, the orangutan looks like a true rebel and breaker of all the rules. Despite its impressive bulk, despite the fact that an adult orangutan is by no means a light creature, it's a true inhabitant of the treetops. It hardly ever descends to the ground and spends the overwhelming majority of its life up above, among the branches and leaves. The most astonishing thing here concerns the large adult males. A strong male orangutan can weigh well over 90 kilograms, and that's a very substantial weight for a creature that lives high in the air. And yet this heavy weight somehow manages to move calmly along thin branches high above the ground, using its enormous long arms like living ropes to ferry its hefty body from tree to tree. If we try to put this into dry numbers, the picture becomes genuinely striking. Of all three great apes, it's the orangutans that spend the most time in the trees. By scientists' calculations, over 90% of their entire lives is spent up there. Just imagine for a moment what that figure means. It means that an orangutan is born in a tree, grows up in a tree, eats in a tree, sleeps in a tree, and finally dies somewhere high in the canopy, almost never touching the ground with its feet. An entire life lived several dozen meters above the surface of the planet, in a green aerial world that for us humans remains utterly foreign and inaccessible. Of course, such an unusual life would be simply impossible if the orangutan's body weren't perfectly adapted to it from the moment of birth. And nature truly outdid itself, building this animal precisely for life among the branches. The orangutan's legs are relatively short, and for a creature that hardly ever walks on the ground, long legs would only be a needless burden. Its arms, on the other hand, are extraordinarily long, much longer than its legs, and it's the arms that do all the main work of getting around. And now the most interesting part. Its hands and feet are built in such a way that they can grip branches like sturdy hooks. An orangutan can grasp a branch with a hand or a foot with equal ease and reliability, and in that sense, it has, as it were, a full 4 hands instead of the usual 2. When it hangs from a branch by a single foot, calmly plucking fruit with its free hands, the sight looks almost too incredible to be real. But what's truly mesmerizing isn't just the structure of its body, it's the very character of its movement. The orangutan doesn't leap from branch to branch the way the swift, nimble gibbon does, literally flying through the forest in lightning bursts. The orangutan never moves abruptly or nervously, never bustles, never hurries. It seems to float slowly through the forest, unhurriedly, and smoothly transferring the weight of its heavy body from one support to another. Before entrusting a branch with its full mass, it first cautiously tests its strength, checks whether it'll hold, and only then moves on. Every movement is thought through and weighed in advance, and in this unhurriedness, there's neither laziness nor stupidity. There's cold calculation and the wisdom of a creature that fully understands the price of a mistake. After all, up there at a height of several dozen meters, one single wrong move, one snapped branch underfoot, can cost an orangutan its life. A fall from such a height can cripple or kill even the sturdiest animal, so the orangutan is cautious not out of natural timidity, but from a deep understanding of just how dangerous the world it lives in really is. And already here, in its very manner of moving, you can glimpse that same attentiveness and that same intelligence that we'll discuss in more detail. Now let's move on to the second great peculiarity of the orangutan, and here a sharp contrast with other apes awaits us once again. We're going to talk about how orangutans arrange their social life, or more precisely, about the fact that they have almost no social life at all. And this is genuinely unusual for large, intelligent apes. Look at the others. Chimpanzees live in large, noisy groups where complex relationships bubble away, with friendships, rivalries, and constant communication. Gorillas stick together in family groups, headed by a mighty leader who protects the females and the young. Even baboons, far more distant relatives of the orangutan, gather in enormous troops where hundreds of individuals live side by side. The life of nearly every ape is a life among its own kind, constantly surrounded by relatives. And against this common backdrop, the orangutan chooses a completely different path. It spends most of its life in complete solitude. This is especially true of adult males, for whom solitude becomes the most ordinary and natural condition. A mighty male orangutan, as a rule, roams the boundless forest entirely on its own, with no companions and no company, moving slowly through its domain day after day. But even such a hardened loner has its own way of announcing itself to the entire forest. The presence of a strong male is signaled by its astonishing calls, which can't be mistaken for anything else. These are very low, deep sounds that carry through the jungle over a vast distance, for whole kilometers in every direction. Scientists call this cry the long call. It's a deep, guttural sound coming from somewhere in the very chest of the animal, something between a menacing roar and a drawn-out, mournful moan. When such a sound drifts over the forest in the morning stillness, it gets under the skin of anyone who hears it. And with this call, the male communicates a great many important things at once. It announces its location to the entire forest. It declares its strength and its dominance. It proclaims that this territory belongs to it, and that strangers aren't welcome here. With its voice alone, without entering into any fight, it scares off possible rivals who'll prefer to skirt its domain after hearing that menacing call. Strong male orangutans have one more striking feature that gives their appearance something solemn and even slightly intimidating. Along the sides of the face on mature dominant males, wide cheek pads grow in, packed with fatty tissue. These pads frame the animal's face on both sides, making it wider and more imposing. From a distance, such a face looks almost like an ancient ritual mask carved by some unknown master. And these unusual cheek discs aren't merely decoration. They serve as a mark of maturity, strength, and high status. By them, the orangutan itself, its rivals, and the females all understand at a glance that this isn't some youngster before them, but a grown, established, powerful master of its territory, one best not to tangle with for no good reason. And yet, behind this outward might and this booming voice lies the other side of a solitary life that mustn't be forgotten. Solitude has its price, and the price is high. In the vast, endless forest, the orangutan remains completely alone with all the difficulties of this world. There's no troop nearby to help find food or warn of danger. The orangutan has to find its own food every single day, with no help whatsoever. It has to watch out for dangers itself and dodge any threats on its own. It alone, in complete solitude, wages its quiet, stubborn struggle for survival day after day, year after year. And it has no right to a mistake, because if disaster strikes, no one will come to its aid. And here's what's especially touching in this whole story of solitude. Despite their hermit-like existence, orangutans aren't at all devoid of deep feelings and attachments. It's just that these feelings are reserved for what matters most, for the one truly strong bond in all their lives. And that bond arises between a mother and her young. It's precisely this remarkable bond, this long and patient upbringing, this astonishing intelligence, and the genuine feelings of the orangutan that we'll talk about in the next part of our story. We're approaching the very heart of our whole story. The thing that, by and large, makes it worth speaking about orangutans so thoroughly and so tenderly, because it's right here, in this part, that the main secret of the red-haired forest hermit is revealed. That very humanity, which people sensed in it many centuries ago, and which for so long they could neither explain nor prove. Now we'll see it in full, and we should begin with the most important thing in an orangutan's entire life. It's motherhood. Despite all that solitude we were just discussing, there does exist in the world of orangutans one bond that nothing can break. It's the bond between a mother and her young. And this isn't just the warm attachment you find in many animals. It's one of the longest and strongest maternal bonds in the entire animal kingdom on our planet. A baby orangutan stays with its mother for a very long time, from 7 to 9 years straight. Just think about that span. For 9 whole years, a single child spends every moment beside its mother, never straying a step from her, learning everything in the world from her. For the wild, that's an almost unimaginably long childhood. To really grasp just how unusual this is, let's compare the orangutan with other animals and see who looks after their young, and for how long. The longest period of parental care on Earth belongs, of course, to humans. Among the indigenous peoples who lived in the wild the way all our ancestors once did, care for a child stretched on for 15 or 20 years, sometimes even longer. We humans hold the absolute record for the length of childhood. Next after humans, with a noticeable gap, come orcas, those highly intelligent marine predators, which care for their offspring for 10 to 15 years. And right after them comes a whole group of intelligent and complex animals, including chimpanzees, gorillas, and our orangutans, as well as elephants, whose care for their young lasts roughly 4 to 6 years. And when you line up the animals like this, a very curious pattern starts to emerge, one worth pondering. A long childhood and lengthy parental care aren't doled out to just anyone. They're characteristic above all of the smartest, the most complex, the most developed animals, of those with a rich inner world and intricate behavior, of those that give birth to very few young and therefore invest everything they possibly can in each one. And the conclusion that follows from this is at once simple and profound. The more complex an animal's life, the more time it needs to learn how to live that life. The orangutan leads a complex life, and so it requires long years of apprenticeship before it's ready to handle everything on its own. Now let's look at what exactly a little orangutan spends 9 years learning. The list of these subjects turns out to be surprisingly long. The youngster has to memorize which fruits in its forest are edible and which are best left alone. It has to learn to tell when a given fruit ripens and turns sweet, and in which corner of the vast forest to look for it. It has to master the difficult art of building a nest out of branches. It has to become thoroughly proficient at moving through the trees, learning to choose reliable branches and to shift its weight smoothly from one support to another. And finally, it has to commit to memory what dangers to avoid and how to safeguard its life. None of this can be packed into a youngster's head in a matter of months. All of it is learned slowly, day after day, beside the mother. And the mother here plays an entirely special role. She carries her young with her almost constantly, never parting from it. At first, the tiny baby clings to her belly, pressed close to her warm fur. Later, as it grows, it climbs onto her back and travels through the forest riding piggyback, surveying the world from on high. And throughout all this time, a special, incomparable bond grows stronger between mother and child. The youngster isn't simply hitching a ride on its mother. It watches her every movement closely, catches her every gesture, remembers her every decision. It learns not from textbooks or from anyone's instructions, but in the good old-fashioned way of imitation. It watches how its mother does it and copies her, gradually turning someone else's experience into its own skill. The memory of orangutans deserves admiration all its own, and above all their memory for space and the location of things. Orangutans can hold in their heads for a very long time exactly where the fruit-bearing trees grow. They remember the locations of these trees across enormous territories for months on end, and this ability will play an important role in our story a little later when we talk about their diet. But let's get back to the everyday life of the orangutan and talk about one of its most touching customs, the nightly ritual of nest building. Every evening, as the forest begins to sink into twilight, the orangutan sets about arranging itself a sleeping spot high in the treetops. Up there, it constructs something like a real bed. First, it carefully selects suitable branches, then bends them and weaves them together, creating a sturdy foundation. And on top, it reinforces the whole structure with soft leaves to make it more comfortable to lie on. In just a few minutes, it ends up with a large, comfortable nest. And this is by no means a primitive pile of twigs, as you might think. It's a thoughtfully designed structure. Some orangutans fashion themselves proper pillows from leaves, build canopies to shelter from the nighttime rain, and even add extra layers for warmth and softness. And what's most astonishing of all, the orangutan builds such a nest anew every single evening. It doesn't return to yesterday's bed. Every night it creates a new home from scratch. That's an enormous amount of work, repeated day after day throughout its entire life. Now let's move on to the most convincing evidence of orangutan intelligence that scientists have observed. And let's start with tools. In the wild, people have many times watched orangutans use various implements for their needs. They pick up sticks to fish insects out of crevices and hollows. They use torn-off leaves as sponges to scoop up water. They shield themselves with branches to fend off sharp thorns, and orangutans living near humans are even capable of handling real human tools. They've been seen wielding saws, hammers, and other objects, and they catch on rather quickly to what a given thing is for and how to use it. But that's not all. Individual groups of orangutans living in different corners of their forests have their own local customs and habits. A particular technique for getting food or a particular way of building a nest may be found in only one specific group and nowhere else. And that, in essence, is the very rudiment of culture. Because what is culture in the simplest terms? It's learned, established patterns of behavior passed from one individual to another, exactly as with us humans. So it turns out that orangutans have something like local traditions, which the elders pass on to the younger ones. And when you gather together everything these animals are capable of, the picture is staggering. Orangutans solve logical problems. They plan their actions in advance. They recognize themselves in a mirror, understanding that what they see is in fact their own reflection. And they even show signs of being able to look ahead into the future and prepare for what isn't yet here. And so we've come to the very summit of this part, to what touches us most deeply, to the feelings of the orangutan. Because these animals aren't merely intelligent, they're capable of truly feeling. Orangutans experience genuine frustration when something goes wrong. They feel fear in the face of danger. Curiosity consumes them at the sight of something new. They grow attached to those who are dear to them. And, most striking of all, they know how to grieve and to long. People who work with orphaned orangutans at rescue centers very often admit that interacting with these animals can be truly hard on the soul. In certain moments, they say, a strange and piercing feeling comes over you, as if what's sitting before you isn't an animal at all, but someone who desperately wishes to say something, someone with a complex, rich world of thoughts and feelings hidden inside, someone trying with all their might to convey something to you, to reach you, to explain, but who cannot, because between you stands an invisible wall of incomprehension. And this feeling, people say, is genuinely unsettling. And once you learn all of this, you start to see the orangutan with completely different eyes. Before us is no longer a curious red ape from distant forests, but a thinking, remembering, feeling being with its own inner world. A creature that builds, learns, plans, loves its children, and grieves. And all the more bitter, then, is the thought that all this richness is now under threat. What exactly threatens orangutans, and why they've come so close to the edge of the abyss, is what we'll discuss in the final part of our story. Before we approach the hardest and most bitter part of this story, we need to understand one more important thing about the orangutan, namely, what it eats, and why its food is so tightly bound up with its entire fate. And, as has happened more than once in our story, the easiest way to understand the orangutan is through comparison with its relatives. Think of gorillas and chimpanzees. These large apes eat enormous amounts of greenery. Their diet is full of leaves, young shoots, juicy stems, and roots. They make do with food that can be found in abundance and is almost always available. The orangutan, in this sense, is a true gourmet and a picky one at that. It aims for the very best, the most delicious, and the most energy-rich food the jungle has to offer. And the best the jungle has, without any doubt, is ripe fruit. More than anything in the world, the orangutan loves sweet, ripe fruits filled with sugar and vigor. These are what it wanders the forest for. These are what it searches for day after day. Among all this fruity abundance, there are particular favorites of the orangutan. First and foremost are figs, which grow in great numbers throughout its forests. And then there are durians. The durian deserves a separate mention because it's a truly extraordinary fruit. The durian is enormous and covered with tough, sharp spikes, like a medieval weapon. But the most famous thing about it is its smell. The durian smells so powerfully and sharply that for many people the aroma is simply unbearable and revolting. This is the legendary fruit that in many countries is banned from planes, buses, and hotels precisely because of its all-pervading odor, which you can't escape. But what feels like a punishment to a human turns into a real celebration for an orangutan. To the orangutan, the durian isn't a stinky fruit, but a precious delicacy, a coveted treasure of the jungle worth a long journey to find. And right here lies the central difficulty of the orangutan's entire life. Trees in the jungle don't bear fruit year-round at all. Their fruiting follows its own particular rhythms and cycles. Some trees bear fruit earlier, others later, and at different times in different corners of the forest, something different ripens, which means the coveted fruits aren't always and everywhere available to the orangutan. The gifts of nature appear and disappear as if obeying an invisible schedule, and the entire life of the orangutan is, in many ways, governed by this very rhythm of fruit ripening. To survive, it must know precisely where and when food will appear in its vast forest. And here, that astonishing memory of the orangutan, which we talked about in the previous part, reveals itself in all its power. Orangutans know perfectly well where the natural pantries are located in their jungle. They remember the locations of fruit-bearing trees, and they know roughly in what season each one is worth visiting. To do this, they wander across enormous territories, moving from one tree they know to another. For many months they hold in their memory where that particular cherished tree grows, and when it will bear fruit. If you try to picture it, every orangutan keeps in its head a detailed map of its jungle, on which all the most valuable fruit trees are marked in red, with notes about when each one must be visited. This is a truly astonishing achievement for a creature without any notebooks or calendars. The orangutan's life, meanwhile, flows in waves, now in plenty, now in want. When a season of abundance arrives and there's plenty of food around, the orangutan eats almost without stopping, gorging greedily and storing up fat for a rainy day. And when the hard, hungry months come, it's forced to switch to far poorer fare. Then leaves, bark, young shoots, and flowers come into play. That is, everything it would normally turn its nose up at. Sometimes the orangutan varies its diet with insects, tearing apart rotting wood in search of termites and ants hidden inside. Once in a while, it can also treat itself to something more substantial, a small mammal or some bird eggs. But still, the most important and most coveted thing in its life is fruit. And since the best fruits grow high in the crowns of the forest's uppermost tiers, the orangutan spends almost its entire life up there, in a world of branches, leaves, and sweet fruits high above the ground. And now, understanding all of this, we can make the most important and most bitter turn in our entire story. Now it becomes completely clear why deforestation is a true catastrophe for the orangutan. When the forest disappears, the orangutan loses not just a roof over its head, and not just shelter from danger. It loses immeasurably more. It loses its pantry, its source of food, its entire world. Along with the fallen trees, that priceless map it had carefully kept in its memory, all its life disappears too. All those cherished trees, all those familiar trails and habitual places suddenly cease to exist. And the orangutan is left in a void, not knowing where to go or where to seek refuge. And the forest that serves as the orangutan's home is disappearing right now, and it's disappearing because of humans. Trees are cut down to clear space for vast oil palm plantations, whose products are so widely used around the world. Forests are felled to build roads, to mine for minerals, to make way for new human settlements. And often people don't bother with slow logging, but simply set the forest on fire to clear the land quickly. These fires constantly slip out of all control and turn into a real disaster. Fire devours thousands of hectares of forest, and kills thousands of animals that can't escape in time. Sometimes such fires blaze for weeks on end, blanketing everything around in acrid smoke. And orangutans turn out to be especially defenseless in the face of all these troubles. The thing is, they reproduce extremely slowly, more slowly than almost any other animal. A female orangutan usually gives birth to just one single baby, and this happens only once every several years. And then for many more long years, she raises and brings up that little one before she's ready for the next. So when orangutan numbers decline, their populations recover agonizingly slowly. Nature simply can't keep up with replacing the losses that humans inflict so swiftly. To deforestation and fires, other troubles are added: the illegal animal trade and hunting. Very often young orangutans are orphaned after their mothers are killed. These orphaned little ones are brought to special rescue and rehabilitation centers. And their people have to do the nearly impossible. They have to teach a young orangutan how to live all over again, all the things a mother would teach it in normal life over 9 long years. And teaching an orangutan to be an orangutan, while remaining a human yourself, turns out to be an incredibly difficult task. How do you explain to a baby how to build a nest, find ripe fruits, and read the map of the jungle if you've never lived in those treetops yourself? And so we've come to the very end of our story. People who've been lucky enough to see a wild orangutan up close almost always describe the experience in strikingly similar ways. First, you hear a faint rustle of leaves somewhere above. Then a reddish glint of fur flashes among the greenery, and suddenly the whole forest seems to freeze and fall silent. The orangutan looks at the human calmly, without fear and without panic, as if unhurriedly sizing up the one who's appeared before it. And then, just as unhurriedly, it turns and slowly walks off somewhere among the branches, dissolving into the greenery and vanishing without a sound, like a red ghost of the jungle that perhaps was never really there at all. Maybe that's exactly why an encounter with an orangutan leaves such a powerful and lasting impression on people. These creatures seem to remind us of something very ancient and very important. They remind us that humans themselves were once an inseparable part of this wild green world, before we left it forever. And looking into the calm eyes of an orangutan, we seem to be peering into our own distant past. And here's the final thought I'd like to leave you with today. Orangutans have lived on our planet for millions of years. In that time, they've weathered shifting climates, terrible catastrophes, and an endless struggle for survival. And they've come through it all, but they may not survive their encounter with us. And that perhaps is the most terrifying part of this whole story. Because in losing orangutans, we're not just losing one more species of animal from a long list. We're losing one of the smartest and most extraordinary creatures ever to have appeared in nature. A being that knows how to build itself a home, learn new things, plan ahead, keep the map of an entire forest stored in its memory for years, and tenderly love its young. And sometimes to look at a human with such a perceptive, such an understanding, almost human gaze that your heart skips a beat. So let's do everything we can to make sure that gaze doesn't vanish from the face of the earth because of us.